When we left off last week, the Romans were at the gates, per se. We have talked through the war between the Jews and the Romans from AD 66 and eventually moving to AD 73, 74. We're not exactly sure what the end date is on that. But there hasn't actually been a whole lot of Roman participation in this war to date. A lot of the fighting has occurred between Jews and Jews, especially inside the walls of Jerusalem. And we've talked about the things that went on inside the walls. But last week, I flew through probably 3 years worth of material, not 3 years worth of my material, 3 years of history. And so in that abbreviation, I missed digesting some atrocities. I threw it in the email. I don't know how many of you were able to read that part of the email, but I just want to mention a few of these things just so you can understand how bad it was before the Romans ever got there. Okay, this is between different groups of Jews and their way of thinking. Speaking of that, in the Sanhedrin, among the Pharisees, we'll say among the Pharisees, you guys have heard me talk about these names before in months past. One leader in Jesus' time, actually just a little bit before Jesus' time, was Shimei. And Shimei was a leader of a school, a philosophical school among the Pharisees. And that school or that teaching generally followed very, very strict interpretations of the law, very strict obedience to the law. On the flip side, another group of Pharisees followed the school of Hillel. Hillel, we've talked about. I know that I mentioned Hillel when we talked about the divorce issue, because Hillel was the one who basically was very liberal in the idea of divorce and what the reasons for which you could divorce. But he had his own following. Often, between these Pharisees, there was a lot of headbutting. And by and large, the followers of Hillel were accepting of the Roman occupation, accepting of the Roman leadership, accepting of non-Jews in the lives of the Jews. The school of Shimei was not. They got to a point where they were very anti-non-Jew. They didn't like anyone non-Jew. Oftentimes, Jesus' own teaching, if you wanted to say, it sided with one or the other, it sided with the, I'm going to say, generosity or the love that's wrapped up in Hillel's teaching, rather than the strictness and the I don't know what the right word for it, but just the crassness of what might be the school of Shimei. But as we get to they're all gone by now in our time period, but leading into the war, leading into the 60s and especially at this time, a lot of those zealots, a lot of those anti-Romans would have probably come from the school of Shimei. And so I think it's important to know that even within the Pharisees, who Jesus often had contradictions with, had conflict with, even among the Pharisees, they didn't see eye to eye and they disagreed with one another. And we're seeing a lot of that outcome when we come to the Jewish war, especially the Jewish war with Rome. So, and I won't rehash all that's happened, but because of these different ideals, we had this trifecta of civil unrest within Jerusalem, where you had moderates against zealots, you had zealots against other zealots, you had priests against other priests, and it's just a bad situation altogether. But going through the histories that we know of, at least that was handed to us from Josephus, things like the execution of people associated with King Herod and other prominent Sadducees or priestly families. That went on without Roman intervention. That happened inside Jerusalem, Jew against Jew. Looting of houses and murder of those encountered in the process, Jew against Jew. Murder of the high priests, who were then thrown over the wall and left unburied. And if you can imagine the religious thought process that was basically trashed for that to happen. The murder of thousands of young nobles, mock trials in order to validate executions that occurred, sacking and looting of the city by the Edomites. Okay, you read the word sometimes, the Idumeans. Idumeans is basically the Edomites, descendants of Edom or Esau. The death of those who chose to leave Jerusalem to escape what was going on there, they were killed as they tried to escape. The cross-dressers, this is something I didn't mention. Josephus tells us that John and his crew, there was a point at which some of his crew dressed up as women and in that garb went out and killed men. Apparently maybe seducing the men, and then as they are involved in the seduction, they kill them. Just some weird and ugly stuff goes on. The death of the innocent who legitimately tried to bring offerings. I mean, and I don't know how this happens within all of this war that's going on, this chaos, but the sacrifices were still occurring. And innocent people were still trying to participate in those sacrifices. But those innocent people are in the very area where fighting is occurring, and they get caught in the crossfire, and they die because of the crossfire. And then I didn't talk last week, but the zealots who had control over the temple, we'll say, elected their own high priest. The former high priests were disavowed. All of them were more Roman interested. And so they found their own, a country, it's kind of presented as a country bumpkin, who they could persuade to do and be what they wanted him to be. And so they elected their own high priest to serve in the temple. So just some bad stuff goes on inside of Jerusalem, Jew against Jew, or sometimes Jew against Edomite, or that sort of thing. Romans aren't necessarily involved. Now, the issues around Rome were kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, and we've talked about that, and it kind of kindled the fire for all this to occur. But Rome was not the reason for a lot of this happening. It was just Jew against Jew. But now we have Rome knocking on the door. Technically, they're knocking on the wall, but we are now in AD 70. Vespasian, all throughout the 67, 68, and some of 69, had been told by Nero, we talked about this, to go put down the uprising that was going on by the Jews. And so he decides on this idea of terrorizing the neighborhood. And so he goes through Galilee first and just starts wiping out Jewish settlements. Now, they didn't have an easy time of that because, at least according to Josephus and according to the time frame, because remember the Jews thought when they kept Cestius from coming into the city, and remember he left for no reason in the world. They thought they were free of Rome, and so they set up their own government, and they sent Josephus and among others north to Galilee to set up fortifications. And so there were already fortified cities in Galilee when Vespasian came in, and so he had to work with those fortifications and eventually conquered all of Galilee, Samaria, and was working on Judea when he got called back to Rome. And we talked about that disturbance in Rome, that year of the 4 Caesars, 4 emperors. Well, he finally got called back to Rome. Most of the military world acknowledged him as emperor. They didn't like the fact that this Vitellius guy was noted as emperor, and so they said, go back and take your throne, basically. And so he was compelled to go back and become emperor. Well, he left Titus, his son. He didn't leave him. He directed him to go back to Jerusalem to finish the job. So now Titus has 4 legions at his command, and those legions are parked right outside Jerusalem. And it was only when those Roman legions came up and presented themselves, possibly even started knocking on the wall, that the folks inside Jerusalem woke up and said, wait a minute, let's stop fighting each other and let's fight the common enemy. Wow, what an idea. Okay. So it was mid-early 70s before they stopped fighting each other and they started fighting Rome, or thinking about fighting Rome. In the 70s, Vespasian had already gone to Rome, been accepted as emperor. Civil unrest in Rome calmed down. So now the time has passed, which would have been most appropriate for an uprising to occur. Now all of Rome's resources can focus on the problem at hand. All right, so mid-April, about 3 days before Passover, AD 70, Titus shows up and he starts boxing in the city. He didn't close it off just yet, but he starts boxing it in and saying, okay, we're about to do a siege. Now, remember, this is 3 days before Passover. There are a number of people in Jerusalem. Because of Passover, people are coming in. Because of all of the insurgents who are excited about the fight, either a fight against Rome or a fight against each other. They just want to fight. So they're in Jerusalem. And then remember, all of the surrounding area had been kind of conquered by Rome. And so you have, in a sense, refugees from those particular environments coming into Jerusalem behind the city walls, because the city walls were the best place, the best safety, the best place to hide. Now, we're going to actually find that Jesus takes the opposite discussion. He says, when you see these happen, get out of Dodge, get out of town. Don't get behind city walls, because of the things that he knows is going to happen. But the Jewish people, as they see things going on, they want to go to the safest place. The safest place, Jerusalem had very good walls. And so they went to Jerusalem. So it's burgeoning population in Jerusalem. We'll talk about numbers when we start talking about how many people died, because there's disagreement as to how many numbers were actually there and how many people died. But there were a lot. We'll just say there were a lot. Jerusalem, by the time Rome showed up, was essentially, and I don't know necessarily how to draw it, but basically this part of it was controlled by John. Remember now John and Eleazar were both kind of allies, but not allies. Eleazar holed himself up in the temple. John controlled the rest. John was that guy from Galilee that conflicted with Josephus. And John came down, gave Titus the slip, came down, got into Jerusalem and started leading things. He's controlling this area, which is the temple and what we know of as the lower city, or at least part of the lower city. The geography of the land, we have high ground here, which is actually the best place to attack Jerusalem, because we have valleys here, very sharp valleys here. There's a valley that runs up between here, and so I think that's kind of the dividing line between what John had and what Simon had. There's a valley that runs up here, and then there's valleys all around here. So this is a very bad place to try to attack Jerusalem. The best place to try to attack is from the north, a little bit to the west. So John had this area, which is also where the temple was. Simon had the rest of this area. Simon was that guy who is from the Edomites, he's not I can't say that he isn't an Edomite, but I don't think he's an Edomite. But he's the one who swept through the Edomite territory and gained a lot of followers. And so now he came into Jerusalem. Actually, he was invited into Jerusalem to counteract things that John was doing. Remember, we talked about that. So now we have these two groups, these two factions that are in control of various parts of the city. Temple, lower city, upper city. Upper city is where King Herod and all of the priests would live. It was the hoity-toity place in town. It was also on another mound. The first mound was here, and that was the old city of David. And then across the valley there was another mound, and that's where Herod built up his palace and all of the upper city, the hoity-toity part of town. And then a little bit later, after Jesus' time, this area was walled in because of population growth, but it wasn't old enough yet to do a lot of cleaning or a lot of building. So it was, there were still graveyards and stuff in this place, which is actually a no-no to living in, as a Jew. But this was a growing area. And Herod Agrippa I built this, what we call the third wall around that area. Well, that third wall is what Titus decides to attack first. Okay. And so, let me see where I am in my notes. As they're camped out here, Jewish guerrilla fighters, remember we talked about a lot of guerrilla fighters, came out and they started picking on the Romans. This is where Titus's youth probably comes in. Vespasian, his dad, when the war started, he was 56 years old, and he was a military vet. He had led the legions in Great Britain, or in Britain, and conquered there. He was a good strategist. He knew what he was doing. Titus was only 24. And so he was still the up and coming. He had shown good leadership, but he didn't quite have the same savvy as his dad. And so it took him a little bit to get in the groove of things, and a lot of the guerrilla fighters started getting in the way because he didn't quite set it up right. But insurgents came out. Titus ordered then all of this land to be just razed, burned to the ground, buildings leveled, to create this flat landscape per se, so that no guerrilla fighter can hide in it, that kind of thing. So he took all of the surrounding area out. So all of the Garden of Gethsemane that we always think about, well, that has been changed because of the war. Titus decides to fight over here, but a lot of dirt has to be moved, remember, because of those valleys. If you're going to build, these siege towers were 75 feet high. If you think about a 7-story building, that's how tall some of these siege towers were. Well, you can't just move those siege towers over most ground, especially ground that's like this. So a lot of dirt has to be moved to level that ground out and make it smooth enough for those siege towers to be moved into place. So that's a lot of what the Roman army did, is they did groundwork. They did engineering for the siege towers. So they moved a lot of dirt. One of the legions this legion had machines. I don't know if they were trebuchets or what they were, but they could throw a 75-pound rock a quarter of a mile. Yeah. Well, they had trouble because if you throw a big rock a quarter of a mile, that takes time to get there. So people on the wall, Jews had spotters, and they would say, "Stone's coming." And so everybody had time to go, hide or whatever. And so the Romans started painting those rocks black to make them harder to see, because the rocks were actually white and they would shine as they were flying through the air. Passover passes. Now we're between Passover and Pentecost, April and May. Siege works were built. They attacked, and they beat this wall down. I couldn't quite figure out, the place that I saw that they beat it down was here, but based on the landscape, this would have been the best place to beat it out. But whichever it is, they beat the third wall down by mid-May, basically early May. And so the Romans took this area in early May. 5 days later, they break through this wall, and they try to get in, but the Jews beat them back. And so it takes another 4 days for them to tear that wall down enough to where they could actually push in to that second area, that inner area here. This is the first wall, and this is a very, very strong wall. Second wall, third wall. Well, they get through the third wall. They're now through the second wall, and they're occupying closer to town. All of the people that were housed here had to push into this town, and the smaller part of town. So all of the population, the burgeoning population, is now being compressed into even smaller areas. Remember, last week we talked about the infighting that happened, and they burned each other's grain storages. So they burned each other's food supply. So now there's famine occurring. Lots of people, no food. Famine is occurring, and it gets worse progressively over time. The Jews who did escape, that they actually went to Rome, the Roman sentries, and said, I surrender. They would report about all the famine that's occurring within the town. They would also report about the robbing, the beating, the torturing, and the murdering that was going on in town. Because these anti-Romans were still trying to persuade people to fight for and with them. And so they thought coercion would be the way to do that. So they were still trying to coerce by murder their own people. Deserters would swallow money. They would sell their goods, swallow the gold or the money that was theirs, and then they would try to leave town. When they left town, Titus and his men were picking them off. And Josephus tells us that up to 500 people a day were being crucified in sight of the wall. And again, this is a psychological war as much as it is a physical war. So he was trying to get them to stop fighting. But it got to a point where they didn't have wood or space to keep it up. Remember, he had burned a whole bunch of area. And so wood was in short supply, especially after they had built their siege engines, these 75-foot siege engines that required a whole lot of material. And so the nearest wood was about 10 miles away. So the crucifixions probably slowed down when they didn't have space or wood. But you can imagine, the sight of this if you're inside the city. But instead of demoralizing the Jews, it hardened them. It made them even more confident, or gave them solidarity against the Romans. I will tell you, these people that swallowed money, once they were dead, the Syrians would cut their stomachs open and try to get the money out. It's barbaric, but that's things that occurred. Mid-June, Titus has his men build an earth wall all the way around the city. And this is to keep people from leaving. It's also to keep new food from coming into the city. So it's something normally that you would do in a siege. You'd starve them out. So he builds this earth wall to keep them from coming in or going out. The famine gets even more severe. People start eating shoe leather, grass. There is a story of a lady who kills her own son and eats her son. So it gives you an image of how bad things are inside the city. And there are a lot of people who really aren't even interested in the war. They just want to live their lives. But they're caught up in all of this. John, who's over the temple, melts down a lot of the temple vessels, and he distributes it to his men for pay, I'm assuming. He also takes the sacred wine and the sacred oil and distributes that to his men. Once Rome comes into the second wall, that's where the Antonio Fortress is. And so they eventually break into the Antonio Fortress. Well, both sides end up severing the Antonio Fortress from the temple grounds. It was apparently connected by these porticos. And so both sides end up, Rome burns one, the Jews burn the other, trying to separate it off. And then the temple itself becomes separated from this fortress that has been there for a long time. Unfortunately, the temple wall proves way too strong, at least at this point and at that place, for the siege engines. And I will say that the Jews actually burned and attacked several of the siege engines, and they fell or burned. And so in order to protect the rest of their siege engines, there was less of that. What Titus ended up doing is going around to the gate, and that gate, I think it was right here, and it was a very hard road up here, because remember, this is a valley, a steep valley. But he gets his men at the gate and tells them to burn it down. Now, remember, in 66, 4 years ago, 4 years prior to this, Cestius is at the same place to burn the gates. His men are at the gates ready to burn it, and then he just cuts and runs. Josephus says, for no reason in the world. I postulated, well, was that God? Because we see throughout time, when God didn't want his city taken, God made it to where his city wasn't taken. So I wonder if God said, not yet. Well, yet has come. Because Titus is back at the same place and is ready to burn the gate. He gives orders to burn the gate. The way Josephus describes it, he didn't really want to burn the gate. He didn't want to do damage to the temple. Now, other historians have said something totally different. Josephus he owed a lot to Titus and Vespasian because they didn't kill him. They didn't send him off to Nero. And so it may be that he was being nice to Titus and tried to make him look better. Other historians didn't have that disposition. But one way or another, they burned the gate. They made a hole. According to Josephus, Titus told them to put out the fire. And then he waited a day or so and had this council to try to figure out what to do with the temple. Do we take the temple, destroy it? Do we try to make peace, keep the temple the way it should be, or without destroying it, without hurting the temple? Because even when you talk about things spiritual, things godly, other nations recognize things spiritual and godly, and many other nations embrace or accept the gods of other nations. And so it could be that they were thinking, we don't want to disturb the God of the Jews by tearing down their temple or destroying the temple. We don't know. Go ahead.
I'm really sorry, but I can't resist a side question, which I totally understand.
No, that's fine.
If you want to put off for another day. Where was the Ark of the Covenant by this time?
Long gone. Long gone. As far as we know, when the first temple was destroyed, the ark disappeared. When the story among the Jews was that Jeremiah took the ark and hid it in a place that no one knew where it was. In fact, when people tried to follow him to find out where it was, he killed them. That's the story among the Jews. We don't know after the destruction of that first temple by the Babylonians where it went, what happened to it. So this temple has been without the Ark of the Covenant from day one, when it was rebuilt. It was never there in the second temple. But you still had the mercy seat. You still had, some of the other artifacts. They rebuilt a lot of that stuff, but the original Ark was not there. But I hear that if you really want to know, Indiana Jones knows where it is. Yeah. That's right. There's a lot that shows up in Revelation. But technically speaking, we don't know where it is at this point. But there are a lot of other artifacts and articles that are there. Another thing that I don't think we have at this point is Aaron's staff. And there are other things that were kept. The Moses staff that was turned, the brazen serpent. Actually, we know that was burned down by Josiah, I believe. One of the kings in the Old Testament, as he was purging all of the idolatry that happened. Yeah. So we're at the point, Titus is knocking on the door. Actually, he's already in the door of the temple. Titus is basically, he now has access to the outer courts of the temple. And he's trying to figure out what to do with the actual temple, not just the courts, but the actual temple. The Jews are still pestering the Romans. They're still, going out on sorties and battling the Romans. Well, in the course of some of these battles, Josephus tells us, I'm not going to go into the details because there's question as to exactly the motivations, but Josephus tells us that Titus did not order the temple burned, but other historians say he did order it burned. One way or another, in the midst of one of these engagements with the Jews as they came out in their sorties and battled the Romans, a Roman soldier threw a burning cinder into one of the adjacent rooms, the rooms adjacent to the temple, the primary temple proper. According to Josephus, Titus was told about it. Titus told him to stop the burning, but that didn't happen. Titus went into the temple. Somehow he got into the temple, looked around. There wasn't a problem. It wasn't on fire yet, but their skirmishes were still going on, and eventually the fire got into the temple and destroyed the temple proper. Now remember the way Josephus described that temple, it had all that gold plating that we already said melted between the rock crevices and the cracks of the rock. And once everything had died down, to get to that gold, you had to tear the rocks from on top of each other to get to that gold. And that was actually one of the benefits of being a Roman soldier, is you could actually keep a lot of the stuff that you looted in the course of the action. But an interesting aspect, and I don't want to make too much of this, but I definitely want to talk about it. The date the temple burned was the same day of the year that the first temple burned and was destroyed by Babylon. Wow. The exact same day of the year. Whether that's providence of God or whether that's an interesting happenstance, I can't say. But it definitely becomes something very important. That day has become something very important in Jewish history and in the minds of Jews, because that is like catastrophe day. In fact, they have attributed other catastrophes to that same day. Whether or not they really occurred that day or not, we don't know. But the temple burning, it's documented that it burned on that same day. This happened to be, Josephus says, the 10th day of Ab, which it's hard to know exactly in our calendar, the Julian calendar, what day that was. We think it was early September. If you go back to Jeremiah 52, it's the last chapter in the book of Jeremiah. verse 12, it says, on the 10th day of the 5th month. Guess what? That's the 10th day of Ab to them. In the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, this commander, I won't say his name, of the imperial guard who served the king of Babylon came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses in Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. So that's the 10th day of this month Ab. Josephus tells us that's the same day, 10th day of the month of Ab, that Titus, the Romans, burned the temple. It's just an interesting curiosity that it happened on the same day. There are some resources that say it was actually the 9th, but those resources say it was the 9th on both days, Babylon and Rome. So whether it was the 9th or the 10th, and you remember how the Jewish day starts on the preceding evening, that may have something to do with the timing and why some history books say 9th versus 10th. But both, whether they say the 9th or the 10th, they say that both happen on the same day of the year. While they were burning, and while Rome now had gotten into the temple and was making way out, Josephus tells us there were false prophets that were telling people to go to the temple because God's going to help them. And so there were a number of people that went to the temple, and as they came, the Roman soldiers killed them. They were caught up in the flurry, and so false prophecy, right? There were, Josephus makes note of a number of signs of the coming destruction. And he talks about a temple gate, a heavy temple gate that took 20 men to close, opening on its own accord. He talks about a star that resembled a sword standing over the city. He talks about a comet that was in place all year, a brilliant light that shone around the altar, visibly seen by the people who were there. Visions of battles in the sky. And this is not during this skirmish. This is back in 1966. This is back in AD 66. In AD 66, apparently, there was visions of battles in the sky. Remember back when Elisha and his servant were under attack? His servant walks out the door and says, "Oh no, what are we going to do? Look at all these people." And Elisha says, "Oh, don't worry about that." I think it was Elisha. It wasn't Elijah, was it? It was either Elijah or Elisha. I can't, for some reason, I can't remember right now. But it says, "What are we going to do?" And Elijah or Elisha says, "Oh, well, the army that's with us on our side is much bigger than the army that we're seeing." And he prays that God opens the eyes of the servant, and he sees all of these spiritual wars, chariots and soldiers in the sky or on the mountainside. Think about that, which is there in the Bible, and overlay that with what Josephus says was seen in AD 66, that there was a spiritual army seen visibly in the sky. Not only Josephus, but I had to pull this out. Josephus says, too many notifications here. On the 21st day of the month, of this month that I don't know the word, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable. So Josephus is like, this, it doesn't seem real, and I would even think that it's not real, were it not related by those who saw it. So it was visible and witnessed by people who saw it. And were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For, before sunsetting, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding of cities. Tacitus, the Roman historian, says, In the sky appeared a vision of armies in conflict, of glittering armor. Pseudo-Hegesippus, I don't know his name, also describes the coming of Christ on the clouds with his mighty angels at this time. He writes, a certain figure appeared of tremendous size, which many saw, just as the books of the Jews have disclosed. And before the setting of the sun, there were suddenly seen in the clouds chariots in the clouds, and armed battle arrays by which the cities of all Judea, Judea and its territories were invaded. There was apparently witnessed by a number of people these spiritual entities in the sky. Hold that thought. Okay. Apparently Josephus says there were voices that were heard in the temple giving warnings about the coming destruction. So what we see is the people were so focused on victory or their own passions that they either neglected to see, ignored, chose to ignore, I don't know what the word is, didn't heed all of these potential signs that were saying the end is coming. Okay. There were masses of Romans masses of deserters that went to the Romans. Josephus talks about 40,000 of them that were captured and released. So there were a lot of these people that just tried to, just go. Just get out of Dodge. What we see is a bunch of the rebels. Once Rome comes in and Titus gives the order to sack the city, they hold themselves up in the upper city. And again, we have Herod's palace and especially some very, 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 very strong towers over here near Herod's palace. So they hold themselves up there. And so Titus pushes that direction. He also starts another siege engine build over here. And while that's happening, a lot of people forfeit. We're told about a priest that gives some of the temple treasures to Titus in order to buy his freedom. Let's see. A lot of the robes, the priestly robes, were part of that. So these are the things that Titus would have taken back to Rome and displayed as part of the victory. And in fact, we see on the Arch de Triomphe, or whatever that is, in Rome, that it honors Titus and the victory over the Jews. We see emblems of these temple artifacts that were brought back to Rome in part of that victory. I'm saying a lot. My mom would get me. In about 15 days, we are pushing the end of August, beginning of September. In about 15 days, these siege ramps were built. But there was no fight. Because once they were built, for some reason, the Jews that had held themselves up forfeited and either gave up or, let's see, what was the word that I used? Fled, surrendered, or hid. And those that hid were found and taken captive. Simon, the guy that was over this area, was one of those that hid and was found. I believe he was killed. I believe John was taken back to Rome and eventually killed. Could be wrong about that, but both of them were killed for the grievances that they caused Rome. By the beginning of September, Rome was in control of the entire city, and the soldiers had leave to go through town and kill it at will, basically, for a while. But Josephus tells us they tried to do that, and they did that, but oftentimes they would go into a house that was already full of dead people because of the famine, because of the murdering and butchering that had already occurred. And the streets were filled with dead people, and blood runs through the street like a river. Just if you can just imagine, we're talking a small area now, because they're not in here anymore, they're down here. And all of those people were pushed into that one little area. Here's a quote from Josephus. When they went in numbers into the lanes of the city with their swords drawn, they slew those whom they overtook without, and set fire to the houses whither the Jews had fled, and burnt every soul in them, and laid waste to a great many of the rest. And when they were come to the houses to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper rooms full of dead corpses, that is, of such as died by the famine. Then they stood in horror at this sight, and went out without touching anything. But although they had this commiseration for such as were destroyed in that manner, they had not the same for those who were still alive. They ran them through with their swords. They were fine with doing that. And obstructed the very lanes with their dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood, to such a degree indeed that the fire of many of the houses was quenched by the men's blood. And that's his quote. According to Josephus, over 1 million people died. 1.1 million people died. Historians doubt that. Historians say it was probably closer to 600,000. Tacitus tells us it was probably 600,000. Josephus tries to substantiate his number by telling us the number of sacrifices that were brought for Passover. When Cestius, remember Cestius in 66, tried to come in and conquer, and he hightailed it back, he had to report to Nero why he had to hightail it back. Well, one of the parts of the report was how many people there were in the city. And so he got from the priests that along the route, he got from them that there were 256,000 sacrifices, 255,000, 250 some odd thousand sacrifices. And according to Josephus, no more or no fewer than 10 people per sacrifice, according to the regulations. So if you extrapolate that out, there are 250 million people in the city at that time. Now, this was back in 66, but he's trying to substantiate how that number of people could be in this area. Now, other scholars would tell you that there's no way that that area could house that many people. Maybe not. But we can say it was a lot, and it was something that area had never known before. That was an atrocity that the Jews had not known to that time, especially in such a concentrated area. Jerusalem fell. It took 4.5 months to fall. But the war wasn't over. Titus went back to Rome, and he left some other people in charge for the next couple of years, 3 or 4 years. There were some holdouts. Remember the Herodian? That was one of the fortresses of Herod. Mercurius, that's where John the Baptist was killed. And Masada, those were 3 strongholds that rebels still held. And so these other military commanders, after Titus left town, were left to take care of those areas. And by AD 64, possibly AD 63, all of those were now subdued. So that war lasted from 66 to 63 or 73, 74. That approximately 7 years. Which, to kind of go back to what I had started, to me, that matches what Daniel says in that last set of 7, in the middle of which the sacrifices will cease, based on what Daniel said. So I kind of put 2 and 2 together and come up with 5 on that, but that's what I see. Next time we meet, we will we'll get back to Matthew 24, and we will start going through Matthew 24, but we're going to talk about this idea of eschatology before we start pushing through Matthew 24, because I want to introduce the way some people view Matthew 24. It's not the way I view it, but I want to show how some people view it, and then contrast that with what we've already discussed about the destruction of Jerusalem and how that might fit with what we see in Matthew 24. And as we walk through, we'll be able to pull or tease out some of that eschatology. That's the study of the end of the world per se. Okay. And so next time we meet, we'll talk about that, and then we'll start working our way through Matthew 24, getting back to the text. But let's pray, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, thank you so much that we can look back at history and we could understand how you work within history. We in this room are so grateful that you have opened the door of salvation to not just the Jews, but also those outside of the Jewish heritage. And we're so grateful that the new covenant was established through Christ, that we can come to you, that we can have your Spirit working within us, that we can meet you personally, and that you're not housed in a temple made with hands. Help us to live like that, Lord. Help us to always focus on you in all that we do, and to shine your light. Let your light shine from the temple that is within us as we walk this earth and lift up the news of your Son, our Savior. Father, we pray this in his name. Amen.